The ranch hands were already backing away when the wild stallion suddenly stopped fighting and lowered his head to the one person nobody expected. Dust exploded beneath pounding hooves. The sharp crack of a fence post echoed across the corral. Men shouted and scrambled aside as the black stallion reared high enough to blot out the afternoon sun. Then the quiet bride stepped forward. No rope, no whip. Just a steady hand and a strange calm that seemed to slow the air itself. Even Mason Brooks froze where he stood, because what happened next made him question everything he thought he knew about the woman he had married, and why the horse looked at her as if it remembered something no one else could see. If you enjoy heartfelt Western love stories, come ride along with us. The wagon rolled into Wind River just before sunset. Dust drifted across the main street. Horses stood tied outside the general store. A few ranch hands leaned against the hitching rail, watching the wagon the same way people watched a storm gathering on the horizon. Mason Brooks sat in the driver's seat with the reins in his hands. He wore a faded brown coat and a weathered black hat. His expression gave away nothing. Beside him sat Josephine Carter. She held a small carpet bag in her lap. The fabric had been repaired more than once. Her dark blue dress was clean but worn from travel. She kept her eyes forward and said nothing. That silence became the first thing people noticed. The second thing was how little she seemed to care about being noticed. "Well, I'll be damned," one man muttered outside the barber shop. Another chuckled. "That's the woman Brooks married?" The comments followed them down the street. Josephine heard every one of them. She never turned her head. Mason heard them too. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. The wagon stopped in front of Rose Tanner's diner. Rose stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Josephine. Then she smiled. "Long trip?" Josephine nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Come inside. Coffee's fresh." It was the first kindness she had received all day. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and beef stew filled the room. The wooden floor creaked beneath every step. Rose set down 2 mugs. Mason thanked her. Josephine wrapped her hands around the warm cup. For several seconds, she simply sat there, feeling the heat. Outside, voices continued. The town was already talking. By morning, everyone would know. The quiet bride, the stranger, the woman nobody understood. An hour later, they arrived at Broken Mesa Ranch. The ranch spread across the valley beneath the shadow of distant mountains. Corrals, barns, bunkhouses, and long fences stretched toward the fading horizon. Earl Dawson met them at the gate. The old ranch manager removed his hat. "Welcome to Broken Mesa, Miss Carter." "Thank you." That was all she said. Over the next days, Josephine settled into the ranch like she had always belonged there. She woke before sunrise, swept floors, patched torn saddle blankets, mended a broken shirt for Earl without being asked, cooked simple meals, never complained, never asked for anything. Mason noticed. So did everyone else. But the whispers continued, especially from Luke Tanner. One evening after supper, Mason stepped outside the house and noticed a lantern glowing inside the horse barn. The hour was late. Most people were asleep. Curious, he walked toward the light. Inside, the barn was quiet except for the rustle of hay and the distant wind outside. Josephine stood beside an old mare with an injured leg. Her hand rested gently against the horse's neck. The animal, usually nervous around strangers, stood perfectly still. Another horse stretched its head over a stall door toward her. Then another. Mason stopped walking. Something about the scene felt strange. Not magical. Just natural. Like the horses trusted her for reasons they understood, and people did not. Josephine never noticed him watching. She simply continued speaking softly to the mare. The words were too quiet to hear. The next afternoon, several ranch hands gathered near the corrals. Luke Tanner leaned against a fence post with a grin. "Well," he called loudly, "looks like the boss finally found somebody willing to marry him." Laughter followed. Another cowboy joined in. "Maybe she lost a bet." More laughter. Josephine carried a bucket across the yard. She neither slowed down nor looked up. The silence somehow made the jokes sound smaller. Luke's grin faded. For the first time, Mason stepped forward. His eyes followed Josephine as she disappeared into the barn. He watched longer than he meant to, long enough to realize something uncomfortable. The woman everyone kept mocking was the strongest person on the ranch, and he still knew almost nothing about her. Far away inside the barn, a horse nickered softly. Josephine paused beside the stall and rested her hand against the wood, as if she had heard it call her name, as if she understood things no one else did. And for the first time, Mason Brooks found himself wondering who his wife truly was. The question stayed with him through the rest of the week. It followed him across the north pasture, where frost still clung to the grass before sunrise. It sat beside him at breakfast, while Josephine quietly poured coffee into chipped enamel cups. It lingered in the barn while he checked feed records and repaired broken tack. Every time he looked at her, he noticed something new. Not something dramatic. Small things. The way frightened horses calmed when she entered a stall. The way she always approached animals from the side instead of head-on. The way she never raised her voice. One windy afternoon, trouble arrived again. The trouble had 4 legs. Outlaw. The black stallion slammed against the inside of his stall hard enough to rattle the entire barn. Luke Tanner jumped backward. "Damn fool horse nearly took my arm off." The stallion's ears flattened. His dark coat gleamed beneath shafts of sunlight coming through the barn roof. Beautiful. Dangerous. And completely unpredictable. Mason stood outside the stall with Earl Dawson. "We can't keep him," Mason said. Earl nodded. "Agreed." The old manager rubbed his jaw. 3 injured hands in 2 months. 4. Luke held up a bandaged wrist. "Don't forget me." Mason looked at the horse. Outlaw pawed the ground. His breathing came hard. The animal looked angry, but there was something else beneath it. Something trapped. "Call the livestock buyer in Riverton," Mason finally said. "We'll sell him next week." Silence filled the barn. Then another voice spoke. "No." Everyone turned. Josephine stood near the doorway holding a grain scoop. Luke laughed first. Then another cowboy joined him. Soon, half the barn was smiling. Mason stared at her. "You have something to say?" Josephine looked at Outlaw. Not at Mason. Not at anyone else. "He shouldn't be sold." Luke shook his head. "Lady, that horse belongs in a meat wagon. He belongs somewhere safe." The laughter grew louder. Luke wiped tears from his eyes. "You planning on telling him that yourself?" Josephine nodded. "Yes." That made them laugh even harder. Only Mason remained silent. He watched her carefully. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She genuinely meant it. The next morning, the entire ranch gathered outside the barn. Word had spread. Even Rose Tanner had driven out from town in her wagon after hearing the story. Everybody expected a disaster. The Wyoming sky stretched blue and endless overhead. Cold wind pushed across the valley. Dust rolled through the corrals. Outlaw paced inside the stall. His hooves struck the wooden floor like hammer blows. Mason stood near the gate. Every muscle in his body felt tight. "This is a mistake," Luke muttered. "Probably," Earl replied. Josephine walked forward. No rope, no whip, no heavy gloves. Nothing. Just her plain brown coat and worn work boots. The stallion saw her immediately. His head shot upward, A violent snort echoed through the barn. The horse charged toward the door. Several men stepped back. Josephine didn't. She stopped several feet away. Then she simply stood there. The wind rattled loose boards overhead. Nobody spoke. Outlaw slammed one hoof into the dirt. Then another. Dust rose around him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Mason felt his pulse pounding. He was already preparing to move if things went wrong. Then Josephine took one slow step closer. The horse froze. Another step. The stallion tossed his head. His muscles remained tight. But he didn't attack. He listened. Nobody could hear what Josephine whispered. The words vanished beneath the wind. Minutes passed. The crowd grew quieter. Even Luke stopped joking. The horse's breathing gradually slowed. The violent movements faded. The tension inside the stall seemed to drain away little by little. Then something happened that nobody expected. Outlaw lowered his head, just slightly, a few inches. But enough. The entire barn seemed to stop breathing. Josephine slowly lifted her hand. The stallion stared at her. Another second passed, then another. Finally, the black horse stretched his neck forward. His nose touched her palm, softly, like a question. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence felt enormous. Luke's mouth literally hung open. Rose Tanner whispered something under her breath. Earl removed his hat. Mason couldn't take his eyes off the scene. The horse that nobody could handle stood perfectly still beside his wife, as if he had known her forever. Josephine gently rested her hand against Outlaw's face. The stallion closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then the barn erupted. Voices, questions, disbelief, everyone talking at once. But Josephine stepped away quietly. She didn't celebrate, didn't smile, didn't look proud. She simply walked toward the barn door, as if this had never been about proving anyone wrong. Mason followed her outside. The afternoon sun hung low over the valley. She stopped near the water trough. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mason finally said, "I thought he was going to hurt you." Josephine looked toward the distant mountains. "He wasn't angry." Mason frowned. "He nearly injured half my ranch." "He was afraid." The answer came so softly he almost missed it. Mason looked back toward the barn. Outlaw stood quietly inside his stall. For the first time since arriving at Broken Mesa, Josephine met his eyes directly. Sometimes people mistake fear for something else. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Mason standing alone beside the trough, watching her disappear toward the house, and wondering why her words sounded less like they were about a horse, and more like they were about herself. The thought stayed with Mason long after the conversation ended. Winter settled deeper over Wind River. Thin layers of snow appeared on the fence rails each morning. The mountains beyond Broken Mesa looked closer now, their white peaks shining beneath clear Wyoming skies. Life at the ranch continued. But something had changed. The distance between Mason and Josephine no longer felt quite as wide. A few days after Outlaw's transformation, Mason walked into the barn before sunrise and found Josephine already there. Lantern light flickered against the wooden walls. Outlaw stood calmly beside her. The same horse that once terrified everyone now lowered his head whenever she approached. Mason leaned against a stall door. "You've made him look easy." Josephine smiled faintly. "He isn't easy." Outlaw nudged her shoulder. "He's honest." Mason found himself smiling back. It surprised them both. The days that followed brought small routines neither of them mentioned. They rode together to inspect distant grazing fields. They repaired sections of fence damaged by early snowstorms. They shared lunches from the same canvas satchel while sitting beside creeks lined with frozen cottonwoods. Nothing dramatic happened, yet those quiet hours began to matter. One afternoon, they delivered supplies to Wind River. The wagon rattled along the dirt road while cold wind swept across the open prairie. At Rose Tanner's diner, Josephine helped unload sacks of flour. Rose handed her a fresh cinnamon biscuit wrapped in cloth. For the ride home, Josephine thanked her softly. Rose smiled. The kindness seemed simple, but Mason noticed Josephine holding the warm biscuit carefully the entire trip back, as though she wasn't used to receiving gifts. That evening, snow began falling. Large flakes drifted through the darkness. The ranch grew silent. Near midnight, Mason woke unexpectedly. A strange feeling pulled him from bed. He lit a lamp and glanced outside. A figure sat near the barn, alone. Josephine. The next night it happened again, and the night after that. Always the same. She would leave the house after everyone slept and sit outside the barn until dawn, never speaking, never moving much, just watching the horses. Several days later, Mason finally approached her. The air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. His boots crunched softly across frozen ground. Josephine looked up when he arrived. Neither spoke for a moment. Outlaw shifted inside the barn behind them. "You don't sleep much," Mason said. "No. You haven't for a long time." She stared toward the mountains. The silence stretched. Then slowly she spoke. "My father raised horses." Mason waited. "Outside St. Joseph, Missouri." Her voice remained steady, but her hands tightened around the coffee cup she carried. "He loved them." A gust of wind passed through the pines. "He built a small stable himself, every board." She paused. "One year several horses disappeared." Mason listened quietly. "The sheriff blamed my father." The words came slower now. There wasn't much proof, but people believed it anyway. Snow drifted across the ground between them. My father was arrested. Her gaze remained fixed on the darkness. He died before anyone ever learned the truth. Mason lowered his eyes. Josephine swallowed. "After that, nobody wanted to hire us." She laughed softly. It wasn't really laughter. "People decide who you are, then they stop listening." Neither moved. The barn lantern glowed behind them. Outlaw snorted somewhere inside. For the first time, Mason understood why she recognized fear so easily, why she never rushed to judge, why she spoke to frightened animals the way she did. She had spent years carrying wounds nobody could see. Slowly, Mason reached toward her. His hand hesitated halfway, then continued. Josephine looked down as his fingers gently covered hers. No promises, no speeches, just a simple gesture. For a moment she didn't pull away. The wind seemed quieter, the night less cold. Then hoofbeats echoed from the road leading into Broken Mesa. A rider approached through the darkness. The next morning, the entire ranch learned his name. Silas Whitmore, bank owner, land investor, one of the wealthiest men in Wyoming. His polished black carriage arrived shortly before noon. Cowboys gathered near the yard to watch. Silas stepped down wearing a tailored wool coat and expensive gloves, the kind rarely seen in Wind River. He exchanged greetings with Mason. Then his eyes drifted across the yard, toward Josephine. The moment he saw her, something changed. Only briefly. A flicker, a tightening around his mouth, as if he had just seen a ghost he never expected to find. Josephine froze. Silas recovered quickly and tipped his hat. But Mason noticed, and so did she. Neither spoke about it. Yet as Silas's carriage rolled away later that afternoon, Josephine stood motionless beside the barn, watching the road, watching the man disappear into the distance. Because for the first time in years, someone from her past had just found her. Josephine barely slept that night. The wind rattled the window panes of the ranch house while moonlight stretched across the floorboards. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Silas Whitmore's face, not because he had spoken to her, because of the look he had tried to hide. Recognition. Fear. The next morning she stood beside the kitchen stove while coffee simmered in an iron pot. Mason entered quietly. He noticed the untouched breakfast plate. "You didn't sleep." Neither had he. Josephine folded a dish towel. "I knew him." Mason stopped. She looked toward the frosted window. "He lived near our town years ago." That was all she said, but it was enough. Something about the way she spoke made Mason listen carefully. The weeks that followed brought trouble to Broken Mesa Ranch. Small things at first, then larger ones. A supplier from Riverton canceled a feed shipment without warning. A cattle buyer withdrew from a signed agreement. A bank notice arrived demanding early payment on part of Mason's loan. The paper sat on his desk beside several unpaid invoices. The timing felt too perfect, too deliberate. Earl Dawson noticed it too. One snowy evening, he removed his spectacles and stared across the office. "Somebody's leaning on people." Mason didn't answer, because he was beginning to suspect who. 3 days later, Silas arrived again. This time he came alone. His polished boots stood out against the muddy ranch yard. He stepped into Mason's office carrying a leather portfolio. "I'll make this simple." He slid several papers across the desk. An offer to purchase Broken Mesa Ranch. The amount was generous, enough to make many men accept immediately. Mason never even picked up the documents. "No." Silas smiled faintly. "You should think carefully." "I already did." The smile disappeared. Silas buttoned his coat and walked out. By sunset, the snow had started falling again. Heavy this time. The kind that turned roads into white ribbons stretching across the valley. That evening, Josephine rode into Wind River alone to collect supplies. The town seemed quieter than usual. Lanterns glowed through windows along Main Street. As she passed the hotel, voices drifted from an open side door. She recognized one of them. Silas. Instinct made her stop. The men inside never saw her standing in the shadows beside a stack of firewood. "We force Brooks long enough," someone said, "and he'll sell." Silas answered calmly. "He doesn't need to agree immediately." "What about the woman?" A pause followed. Then Silas spoke again. "Leave her to me." Josephine's stomach tightened. The snow seemed colder suddenly. She stayed hidden until the conversation ended. Then she rode hard back toward Broken Mesa. The next morning, she told Mason everything. He listened without interruption. When she finished, silence filled the room. "You believe me?" she finally asked. Mason looked directly at her. "I do." No hesitation. No doubt. Just 4 simple words. For a moment, Josephine looked away, because nobody had said those words to her in a very long time. The days that followed brought another discovery. Josephine began searching through old county records stored in boxes at the sheriff's office. Most contained property transfers, livestock sales, and decades-old tax documents. Dust covered nearly everything. Late one afternoon, she found a familiar name, Silas Whitmore, and beside it, a record connected to Missouri, connected to the year her father's horses disappeared. Her hands trembled. The pieces were beginning to fit together. But records alone proved nothing. Nobody would challenge the richest man in Wyoming without evidence. Then something unexpected happened. A winter storm trapped everyone at the ranch for 2 days. During the second evening, Earl Dawson disappeared into an old storage shed near the barn. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box covered in dust. I forgot about this years ago. He set it carefully on the table. Inside were ledgers, receipts, old shipping records. Mason opened the first book. Several loose pages slipped onto the table. Earl adjusted his glasses. I kept these from my cavalry days. Some livestock contracts passed through my hands. Josephine leaned forward, then froze. There it was. A name. Silas Whitmore. Written repeatedly across several entries. Horse transfers, payments, transactions dated just weeks before her father's arrest. The room became very still. Outside, snow struck the windows. Inside, Mason slowly turned another page, and another. Each one revealed more. Enough to suggest that the story everyone believed years ago had never been true. Josephine stared at the ledger. The answers she had chased for years might finally be within reach, but only if they were willing to challenge the most powerful man in Wind River. And for the first time, they had proof that Silas Whitmore was afraid of being exposed. The storm finally passed 3 days later. Fresh snow covered the valley like a white blanket stretching from the riverbanks to the distant foothills. Mason, Josephine, and Earl spent the next week organizing every document they could find. The old ledger wasn't enough by itself. They needed witnesses, records, names, anything that could connect Silas Whitmore to the thefts that had destroyed families years ago. Word spread quietly through Wind River, not through gossip, through questions. Questions Silas had spent years making sure nobody asked. Sheriff Walter Hayes agreed to review the documents. At first he remained cautious. A banker like Silas carried influence far beyond the town limits. But the more papers he examined, the quieter he became. One evening he removed his hat and rubbed his forehead. I think you may be right. The room fell silent. For Josephine, those words felt heavier than any snowfall, because someone in authority was finally listening. 2 weeks later, a public hearing was scheduled inside the town assembly hall. The entire valley seemed to show up. Ranchers, merchants, farm families, cowboys still wearing trail dust on their boots. The wooden benches filled before sunrise. Outside, horses stood tied to hitching rails beneath a pale winter sky. Inside, tension hung in the air. Silas arrived wearing a dark wool coat and carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had spent years controlling every room he entered. When he saw Mason and Josephine seated together, his expression hardened. The hearing lasted hours. Documents were presented, property records, horse transfers, financial transactions, one by one. Then Earl Dawson took the stand. His old voice remained steady. He explained where the ledger came from, how the records had been stored, why he had kept them. The room listened carefully. Next came 2 elderly ranchers from Missouri, men who had known Josephine's father decades earlier. Their memories filled gaps the documents could not. Slowly, the picture became impossible to ignore. Silas had participated in a scheme that targeted struggling horse breeders. Animals disappeared. False accusations followed. Land changed hands, and people lost everything, including Josephine's family. For the first time all afternoon, Silas appeared nervous. His confident answers became shorter. His eyes drifted repeatedly toward the exits. By sunset, the truth stood in full view. The sheriff announced that a formal investigation would begin immediately. Several business holdings connected to Silas would be reviewed. The room erupted into conversation. Some people looked shocked. Others looked ashamed. Many simply sat in silence. Josephine remained seated. She felt no triumph, only stillness. After all these years, her father's name had finally been cleared. The burden she had carried across states and seasons no longer belonged to her. Several days later, a notice was posted outside the sheriff's office. The charges against her father had been officially removed from county records. Rose Tanner hugged Josephine outside the diner. Even Luke Tanner shook her hand. The same people who once doubted her now tipped their hats when she passed. But healing did not arrive as quickly as justice. One cold morning, Josephine packed a small travel bag. Mason found it sitting beside the front door. Neither spoke immediately. The fire crackled softly inside the stove. "You plan on leaving?" It wasn't a question. Josephine nodded. "The trouble followed me here. It followed Silas." She looked down. "If I stay, people will always remember what happened." Mason stepped closer. "They'll remember what you survived." She didn't answer. That afternoon, she walked toward the barn one final time. Outlaw stood waiting inside. The stallion lifted his head the moment she entered. Outside, the sun hung low above the snowy ridges. Footsteps approached behind her. "Mason." He stopped beside the stall door. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mason reached into his coat pocket. Carefully, he placed something in her hand. The wedding ring. The same ring she had once returned because their marriage had begun as an arrangement. Josephine stared at it. The metal caught the fading sunlight. Mason swallowed. "When you arrived, I thought I was offering someone a place to stay." His voice remained quiet. But somewhere along the way, he looked toward Outlaw, then back at her. It stopped being an agreement. The barn grew still. Only the sound of horses shifting in their stalls remained. Josephine looked at the ring, then at the man standing beside her. The man who had believed her when nobody else would, who had chosen her over money, over comfort, over fear. Slowly, she placed her hand over his. No speeches, no grand promises, just a simple touch. And this time she didn't let go. Spring arrived months later. Snow melted from the hillsides. Green grass returned to the valley. Wildflowers appeared beside the river. During Wind River's annual horse parade, townspeople lined both sides of Main Street. Children waved flags. Storefront windows stood open to the warm breeze. Leading the procession was Outlaw, proud, strong, calm, and sitting in the saddle was Josephine Carter Brooks. The crowd applauded as she passed, not because they pitied her, not because they felt guilty, because she had earned their respect. High above the valley that evening, Mason and Josephine stood together on a ridge overlooking Broken Mesa Ranch. The setting sun painted the mountains gold. Below them, Outlaw raced across the open pasture. Free. The wind moved gently through the grass. Josephine watched the ranch below. The fences, the barns, the home waiting at the end of the dirt road. For years, she had searched for a place where she belonged. A place untouched by old accusations. A place where the past no longer decided the future. At last, she found it. And standing beside the man she loved, she realized something even greater. Home had never been a place. It had been the people willing to stand beside her when the storm came. As the last light faded beyond the mountains, Mason quietly took her hand. This time, neither of them looked away, and together they watched the future unfold across the Wyoming horizon. The sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving the valley wrapped in gold and shadow. Down below, Outlaw ran across the open pasture, his mane lifting in the evening wind. For a long moment, nothing needed to be said. And maybe that's what stays with me most about this story. Not the hearing, not the secrets, not even the years that were stolen from Josephine and her family. It's the quiet truth that some people spend half their lives searching for a place where they can finally put down the weight they've been carrying. If you were standing where Josephine stood that evening, looking back on every door that had closed and every mile that had felt lonely, would you still have found the strength to trust again? Would you have risked opening your heart after so many reasons to keep it locked away? Sometimes healing doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes in small moments. A hand that stays. A promise that doesn't break. A person who sees who you are instead of who the world says you should be. Maybe that's the real gift of a second chance. Not that it erases the past, but that it reminds us the past doesn't get the final word. I'd love to know what part of Josephine and Mason's journey stayed with you the most. Share it in the comments. And if stories like this bring you comfort at the end of a long day, I hope you'll stay a little longer. There are more journeys waiting just beyond the next horizon. Stories of love, resilience, mystery, and the kind of hope that often appears when it's needed most. Until next time, thank you for riding along with us.